Hello and welcome to Become the Teapot. I'm Iain.
And so am I.
It is August 2021 and we are recording a podcast about comic books and their film adaptations. In 2 weeks the episode will be released. You are listening to it now. 24 episodes, 24 hours in a day. Coincidence? Yes. In 30 seconds time the intro music is playing. Afterwards we discuss Watchmen from the year 2009 and compare it to the comic book of the same name by writer Alan Moore and artist Dave Gibbons. But first, we introduce our guest, Chrissie, a friend of ours. What will she think? We will find out. Then Iain will say something about eggs. The future is unclear on that. Strange. Before that though, the music. 3 seconds now. 2 seconds. 1.
So, Chrissie, welcome to the show.
Thanks you. Good to be here.
So, let's start with our famous Q&A section.
World famous.
World famous. These are our tried and tested guest questions. So this gives our listeners a taste of where you're coming from in regards to films, comics, etc. So, what is your familiarity with comics and comic book properties?
So I would say I'm pretty familiar. I'm a huge fan of like the MCU, comic book movies, superheroes in general, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But then sort of the comic books themselves, I'd say I'm probably less familiar. But there's a couple of things that I'm fairly kind of well versed in, I think. So when I was at uni, there was like a unit in my degree about studying comic books, and through that I kind of got really into a lot of Alan Moore. So I read Watchmen and V for Vendetta, Killing Joke, Batman, and things like that. So I'm really familiar with them. And then I've read kind of a couple of Marvel runs as well, like a few, the Ultimate Universe, is that what it's called? And Civil War was I read like that one as well.
Well, it's handy that you say Alan Moore, because that's why you're here. But yeah, don't suppose you remember what your first interaction with a comic book or comic book property was?
Yeah, so early, and this shames me to my very core that this was probably some of the earliest things that I ever watched, but probably the Batman and Robin film was the very first comic thing that I ever watched, which, as a kid, I loved. It was campy, it was ridiculous, it was good fun as an 8-year-old. But, as you grow older, you realise it's, one of the worst things to ever blight this planet.
Well, to be fair, it has got some hilariously bad puns. Nice to meet you.
That, to be fair, that is a highlight, and I'll always be up for watching the compilation of Arnold Schwarzenegger doing ice puns on YouTube. It's great fun. But apart from that, it's pretty shockingly bad. I suppose the other things like cartoons, like Spider-Man cartoon was probably one of my favourites as a kid, when I could wrestle the remote off of my sister to be able to watch it. So yeah.
Okay. So obviously, apart from the comic that we will be talking about in a second, what was the last comic book that you read?
So I struggled a bit over this question because I haven't read one in a very long time, but I think it would have been the comic follow-ups to the Avatar: The Last Airbender cartoon. They're really good. To be honest, I don't remember. It's been literally sort of 4 or 5 years, so I don't remember what they were really about, but they were good fun. They were the last things that I read.
To be fair, I haven't seen the show, so I don't really know much about that.
It's excellent. You should absolutely watch it.
It really is very good. You definitely should. And the comics are good as well from what I've read. I've only started reading The Promise recently, which I think is the first one. And the first 3 volumes, the library edition ones that they do, are based on the original ideas for the next 3 seasons.
Oh, that's
and
cool.
Then I think they're already on like 6 volumes of that now. So
It makes me very excited for what they're going to do with, there's a deal been struck for a whole loads of stuff in that universe, so hopefully we might even see animated versions and stuff of them in the future. Who knows?
Unfortunately, there's a live action adaptation coming again without the original creators.
You think they'd have learned after the first time, but this time I don't think they're going to let M. Night anywhere near it, so It might be a bit better. Fingers crossed.
There'll be no beach that makes people old this time though.
Or the rock dance, to just dance around and rock moves. It's just shocking.
Yeah, as per usual, I have no idea what you're talking about. That seems to be a sort of theme when the guests come on and start talking about things. I'm like, yeah, I don't know what that is.
Avatar.
Well, no, Avatar.
The blue people.
Oh yeah, the blue people, when they make love with their head tails.
That's exactly what we're talking about.
It's a Nickelodeon cartoon.
No, yeah, I've seen little bits, but I've no idea the backstory of the characters. I don't know.
Okay.
But anyway, moving on. Do you have any favourite comic book runs or characters, whether comic books or films or TV?
So for some reason that I can never quite put my finger on, Iron Man has always been my favourite character. I just remember him ever since I was a kid. I was just like, Iron Man, he's awesome. And to be honest, I don't really know much about the character and I've never read any comics of it. I remember seeing the cartoon a bit when I was a kid, as it was kind of in the same vein as the whole Spider-Man cartoon.
Yeah.
And I was like, my whole reason behind him being my favourite character is like, that's a very cool suit. I'd like one of those. That's basically it. But other than that, I've got, no particularly interesting reason as to why I like him. But runs, I think, well, one of the only ones that I've read sort of in its entirety was Civil War. Mm-hmm. That was one that I read from start to finish using the long old checklist that they've got of like 130, 40 comics or whatever.
Oh, wow. So you read all of it then?
I read all of it, and I literally sat there in a chair, I think, for about 4 days and just read the whole thing all in one go. And that was really good at the time.
Cool.
Because we've already covered Civil War on this podcast, and you'll remember at the time, listeners, that my opinion was slightly dampened on the Civil War core comic, but there are a lot of really good comics as tie-ins to that story that are a lot better, I think, than the core central storyline anyway.
Yeah, I think you and Josh were talking about that you'd both read all of it, and I'd just read the 6-issue run that we obviously talked about.
I feel like it would have been a lot less enjoyable had I not read all of it, because it's like 6 issues and it's like, well, it was a whole event and it was really, really exciting. For some reason, I absolutely love a crossover. It's like, oh man, those two characters like in the same place, which I think is why I love the MCU so much. So just seeing all of their separate stories and things, and I mean, despite its flaws, I was just saying earlier that I was listening to your episode on Civil War on my way over here, and I think coming from a place of not really knowing much about it, I think I appreciated it more than I would have done had I known what its flaws were. Basically, you guys ruined it for me, so thanks for that.
I think she means I ruined it for her.
Ian ruined it for me.
Yeah, we'll talk about runs, actually. There's a run called Shadowland. It's a Daredevil run. I've not read all of it, but I do recommend that if you do love a good crossover and a lot of intertwining stories.
I do love those things. I will have a look at that. Thank you.
But yeah, the final question. Do you have any favourite comic book films or TV shows? I mean, you touched on Spider-Man a bit and Iron Man cartoon.
So this, again, was a huge struggle for me to boil it down, because I love the MCU so much. It's my favourite thing. I get so excited about anything, and to be honest, I'm almost blinded by just how much I love the whole crossover thing and the whole kind of concept of it, and that kind of, I guess, makes it difficult for me to see the flaws in things. But that being said, I boiled it down to 2 favourite things. So my favourite TV show has got to be Daredevil Season 1, the Netflix series. And I think, while it's certainly flawed, I think I was so incredibly hyped for it. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, aside from Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., it was the first TV series set in the MCU.
Yeah.
And so because of that, I was just like, wow, that's incredible. And I think I really like Daredevil as a character, and I kind of wanted to see something that wasn't the Ben Affleck film, because that was not good at all. And seeing the trailers for it, I got just incredibly hyped, and it was just all round extremely good. Whatever happened to the Netflix series after that one season I think was excellent.
Yeah, definitely. I think we've talked about it again on the show before, but it was a little bit baggy that first season, but it was nothing compared to some of the later Netflix series. The first series of Jessica Jones was really good as well, but later series they struggled to fill that 13 episode up, but that first series of Daredevil was really, really strong.
Yeah, and it's just, and I didn't know while I liked Daredevil, I didn't know a huge amount about it, but again, it's just, I love a good fight scene, and those were some very good fight scenes.
There was a lot of one-shots in that first season.
Yeah, exactly. The famous, the hallway scenes, that's where it came, and they only built on that in, I think it was, season 3, where they did the one in the prison?
Yeah.
And that's one of the most incredible shots
I think they had one in each season, didn't they? They had the second season was the one where he had to come down the building fighting all that biker gang on the way, and that was pretty good.
Yes, that was good. But yeah, so not only was it just very enjoyable, Kingpin was excellent as well. He was just absolutely perfect. Again, kind of, I think, made up for the sins of the Ben Affleck film. It's just, it was so bad.
I don't think Michael Clarke Duncan was a bad Kingpin, in fairness, but it was not a good film.
There are rumours, actually, that Daredevil and Kingpin will appear in Spider-Man Far From Home, as in the same actors, but I don't know how true that is.
Yeah, but by now there are rumours that everyone under the sun is going to appear in Spider-Man Far From Home.
I heard that Dennis the Menace is going to make an appearance.
I heard that Iain was in it.
Really?
Yeah,
wow.
but I'm not allowed to say, strictly speaking. I'm on a Disney contract, I'm afraid.
Wow, we'll have to cut that bit. And then my movie, I think, as well. So I love the first Iron Man, again, because it was the start of something so incredible. I love the first Avengers. Like I said, I absolutely love a crossover. But I think for me, it's got to be Infinity War. It's got to be my favourite one, just because the culmination of, what was it at the time, 10 years of movies?
Yeah.
And me loving every single one of them, except Thor 2, and it kind of coming to a head. And that film was essentially just non-stop craziness from start to finish. And yeah, I absolutely love that.
Yeah.
It will forever hold a special place in my heart.
I remember seeing that for the first time, and the final scene, and it just ends. And you kind of like, are they going to end it like that? You know, and the whole cinema just went quiet. It was like, wow, they've ended a film, A, with no post-credit scene. Well, there was a little one. But the fact that they lost, it was a big shock.
It was something they'd never done before, I think, and that was why it was so good. I mean, you know, it did all eventually, spoilers, got undone in Endgame, but yeah, just incredible.
Yeah, because I really like the Avengers and, you know, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but even I admit that there is a tendency to be quite predictable, and I think that's what sets Infinity War apart from Endgame, in my opinion, is the fact that it does actually have a surprising ending. You're never quite sure what's going to happen.
Cool. Right, that's the Q&A portion done.
How many points did I get? Did I get lots of points?
Pass. You got a pass, Mark.
Cool, that's good. Good, I'm glad.
That's better than what Josh got. Okay, shall we move on to discussion about Watchmen, the film and the comic book?
Yeah, so we were talking before recording, and you said talking about it like our Sin City episode, where because they're so close, it wouldn't make sense to do film and then comic.
Yeah, when I was building my notes for this episode, I just noticed that I was referring to the comics a lot in my film notes. I was referring to the film in my comics notes, and basically there was no separation between the two. So yeah, I just thought it might be easier if we just talk free form about Watchmen from here on out.
Yeah. Ooh, just to get us talking about it, am I right in saying that the film has a bad rep in regards to the adaptation of what it is?
I think so, although there is some real-life retconning going on in that the Zack Snyder movement with regards to the Justice League has made a lot of fans of his go back and reevaluate this, but I seem to remember the opinion at the time, and certainly for as long as I've known, has been that it is an adaptation that perhaps misses the point.
Yeah, that's one of my huge thoughts of it. You know, Alan Moore, as we all know, is very anti-Hollywood, I think would probably be fair to say. Like, his name's not on the movie. He said, I never want this adapted.
Yep.
And I watched this documentary once that said, he essentially said, I have made Watchmen, maybe not intentionally, but Watchmen is unfilmable. And I think reading the comic and then immediately watching the film afterwards, not only does it make the film worse because you just realise just how much the film misses the point, but you kind of realise that the kind of genius, I think, of using the comic book medium to its full extent to tell such an incredible story, and then it just cannot be translated into film as much as Zack Snyder would like to try. And because of that, it's just, I feel, is not good. It's not a good film.
No, I absolutely agree with that. It's the pacing of the film is all over the place, and that is because all it's tried to do, apart from a few changes, is replicate the comic book. And the comic book, Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons have said they've used every trick in comic book storytelling to tell that story. And so if all you're doing is taking page to screen and saying, right, well, let's take this scene and put that on the screen, and the same pacing throughout, it just is never going to work. You need to actually adapt it if you're going to change it into a film. I think there are one or two really good sequences in the film, and they tend to be where the film has actually used film techniques to tell the story, things that you couldn't do in the comic book. The comic, for instance, uses excerpts and clippings from books and newspapers at the end of each chapter to tell the history of the Minutemen and the Crime Busters. The film obviously couldn't do this, so instead we get that really good montage at the beginning set to Bob Dylan's Times They Are A-Changin', which for me is actually a really good sequence in a sort of bleak and rubbish film. It's a very interesting sequence where he just does a 2-minute opening montage that reflects the history, and you learn a lot about that. That's not in the comic books, it's only for the film. And I think if the film had taken more liberties with how the story is told and focused more on conveying the themes of the comic book and less time slavishly replicating just the aesthetics, I think it would have been a better film.
Yeah, there are things that you obviously learn in the stories in between the chapters. Like, is it Cashman? Whatever that guy's name is.
Dollar Bill.
Thank you. He gets his cape trapped in the door, which I thought I wouldn't have known that if I'd not read the little story bits in between. Because I even actually sent you a text and said, are we reading this? Does your book have that? And he went, yeah. I went, oh, okay. I just thought it was in my special version.
Your special version. You've got a very standard version of the comic book, as far as I can tell.
Well, I didn't know if it was a special version.
That's something I thought as well. It's like when I was watching the movie, it's like, I can't remember because it was a very long time ago, but I think I watched the movie before I read the comic. And yesterday I immediately finished the comic and then went straight to the film. And I was thinking, how would a lot of this make sense if I didn't have the context of the comic book? And like, actually, I made a note about that. It's like Dollar Bill. It's like, I wouldn't understand why he's there. And I think the film also, just, I suppose, using this as an example, misses out the whole point of the backstory of Dollar Bill, rather, which is, you know, in the whole superhero craze, he was like a guy that was hired by a bank to like do superheroics for them and be like a huge PR stunt. And I think that's a big thing the film is missing, is a lot of the backstory that kind of builds this world, this superhero world that we live in. And the main place where this is shown is where all of the Watchmen meet together for the first time. And there's only like 4 or 5 people there in the film. It's just Dr. Manhattan, Silk Spectre, the Owl guy, Rorschach, and Comedian. Whereas in the comic, it's like a whole bunch of them as well. The Owl guy, Nite-Owl, that's
Nite-Owl.
Whereas in the comic, there's a whole bunch of them, and I feel like it's, it kind of, like you said, misses the point because of that, I think.
It doesn't feel like a world, it just feels like a story about these 5 characters. Whereas, in fact, we probably should discuss this. I watched the version of Netflix, which is the original cinematic version. I don't know what version you watched, Iain, but I think, Chrissie, you watched the director's cut.
I watched the director's cut, yes.
So that includes more of the street scenes, the scenes from the newspaper vendor and the young boy reading the comic book and things like that. And I think that's especially what's missing from the standard edition, as it were, the cinematic, the release version, is the human life stories, you know, that you get throughout the comic books, all these little cuts and these excerpts away to real people on the street, which is just completely lost from the film, you know, and it plays such an integral part at the end of the comic book, seeing these people that you've known for 10, 11 issues dead on the street, that when you don't have that in the film, it just feels hollow.
Yeah.
But I mean, actually, I think we should probably address, because obviously you've not read the comic, but you have seen the film before.
Yeah, so I saw the film years ago. I don't know when I first saw it, but I think I only watched it once. I own it. It's something that I own, but again, it was still in the plastic film on my shelf.
Right, yeah.
Not read the comic before.
So as someone who's not read the comic before, what was your opinion of the film, you know, not having that background information?
So the first time that I watched it, to be honest, I don't remember a lot of it when I first watched it. I think the main story plots I knew of, but I think back then I was very much, it's a long film, a lot of slow-mo, clearly a Zack Snyder film.
Yeah.
You know, it has this sort of dark palette, it's sepia tones, you know, just kind of like an artsy-fartsy kind of film that back then when I was younger, didn't read a lot of comics. I didn't appreciate it as much as I do now, I guess. Like I said, it does lose a lot of the character's backstory and mythos.
Yeah.
So I watched the original cut like you did, but I know that there's the director's cut, there's the ultimate cut as well. So there's 3 versions of this film.
Yeah, and they get longer and longer and more of a chore to get through. Especially
Classic Zack Snyder fashion.
Yeah, it's Justice League Zack Snyder cut all over again. Yeah, I mean, the ultimate cut has the animated Tales of the Black Freighter in it as well from the comic book, but the director's cut, I think, still omits those bits but has a bit more of the street scene things.
Yeah, I mean, when I first saw it, didn't think that much of it. I think now that I've gone back after reading the comic, I've enjoyed it a lot more.
Oh, the film a lot more.
Yeah, it's like, even though it's cut out a lot of characters, a lot of the backstory, like you said, there's the newspaper guy, there's the little kid, there's the backstory with the watch that breaks, and that's why John becomes Dr. Manhattan. It's not just, I forgot my watch. There's actually a backstory. Even though they cut it, because I've read the comic, it makes more sense to me.
Right, so you're padding out that information from the comic book. When I watch the film, I think it's frustrating that a lot of these things are missing. I understand that you're not going to get them all in, but I feel like if I were watching this and not having read the comic, I would be very confused. And I don't just take what I know from the comic books and implant it into the film, especially as some of it is contradictory. It's an interesting take because I struggle to do that. I struggle to look at the film and think, right, well, I'm just going to morph that in my mind to be a bit more like the comic books and insert it. I just think that's missing. It doesn't feel as rich as the comic book does. It doesn't feel as in-depth.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to have any of that level of history. It just seems to be very thin.
So I was going to say that, I think like I mentioned earlier, it's reading the comic book and then immediately watching the film afterwards made me enjoy the film so much less. I think mainly because it becomes apparent just how much is missing, and you're immediately thinking like, oh, they missed the point on that. I suppose it just brings it into sharper focus for me, that just how disappointing it is and just how much they've missed, I think.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't say that all the gaps I fill in because of the book. There are bits that I do miss and I wish they had put in there, like the original Nite-Owl getting attacked and killed by the mob, but they've cut that because they didn't have a bit before, so they cut the scene before, so then if they'd done that scene of him being killed, it wouldn't have made any sense.
See that was in the version that I watched.
Yeah.
So, and there was a little, a quick little slow-mo fight scene in there, just for good measure. Yeah.
Could you tell what was going on because it was so slow?
I could tell what was going on so well. It was... Oh man, it was so slow. To be honest, I think most of the extra runtime comes from that one fight scene. It's just so slow.
It's an old man fighting as well. That's already quite slow.
Exactly.
But yeah, also I think that the film loses a lot of humour from the book.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It is quite a dark film, quite a dark-ish comic, or bleak. But there are bits in the comic that I do laugh at, or I do have a little smile.
Yeah. No, definitely. I completely agree. I think Moore trusts his reader enough to throw the reader into the world and then fill in the gaps later. But you've got a grim, grimy, tragic world full of sad, sort of broken heroes. But it's not without this undercurrent of dark comedy that runs almost throughout the entire comic book. A comic that starts as a murder mystery and unfolds into something greater. But it's still, like you say, it has a lot of humour to it. And a lot of that comes from these characters who are very much pastiches of existing characters already.
Mm-hmm.
So my view on the story is that it does what Alan Moore does really well, I think. It follows the superhero mentality through to its logical conclusion. So, for example, Rorschach witnesses such horrors that it essentially breaks him and he goes completely insane, and then he almost becomes the evil, so he turns to killing the villains instead.
Yeah.
Dr. Manhattan, if there's someone with that kind of power, he gets completely detached from worldly concerns. And I think the overall moral message in a lot of ways, and I think this is something that's reflected really well in the Tales from the Black Freighter in the comic, which sadly obviously is not replicated in the film, is that you can't delve into this evil world without it affecting you in some ways, and it's about exploring how it affects different types of people and what being a superhero would really do to humans, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree. Alan Moore's original idea for this comic book was actually to use existing characters, which is a really interesting take because it was going to be all these Charlton comic characters that had not been in use for ages. DC was just getting the rights to them. So he wanted to set it in this existing world that was already more closely akin to our world than, say, DC or Marvel, but was still a superhero world. And he wanted to basically take those characters that had not been used for a while, introduce them into the 1980s and show the logical progression of where they had ended up. So some of these characters you might know, some of them you might not. Both Night-Owls were meant to be the Blue Beetles, so Blue Beetle from DC.
Yep.
They were meant to be them. Dr. Manhattan was Captain Atom, a Silk Spectre Nightshade, Ozymandias was Thunderbolt, Rorschach was The Question, which we'll go on to in a bit when we talk about the characters, is the Steve Ditko link.
Yeah.
And the comedian was actually Peacemaker, who, if you see the trailers for The Suicide Squad, is played by John Cena these days.
Wow.
So that was meant to be the comedian. So they were all based on these pre-existing characters. And that was the original idea for this, was to set it in that world. I think what we end up with, in my opinion, is well, it's difficult to say because you haven't seen the original idea, but I think this is more interesting. What we end up with is this world created by Alan Moore, and he's given it so much history that is completely fake. There is no history, but the whole world feels lived in. It feels very unique to itself, and actually like these people have grown up from when these original crime fighters came around all the way to the modern day, or 1985. But I suppose we should probably talk about the characters, because obviously the comic alternates between plot-heavy issues and then character-focused issues. So every odd-numbered issue is a character-focused one.
Yep.
So what do you make of the characters as they were portrayed in the comic versus how they were portrayed in the film?
Shall we go round and discuss each of the sort of main characters? We've touched on Rorschach a little bit already.
Yeah, so there's a couple of really egregious errors that I do want to talk about, Rorschach and Ozymandias in particular, but we can talk about the others as well. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, well, seems like a bit of an odd thing to say, but I think Rorschach is the Batman character if he was a dick. He's a little bit more serious in a way that he does see the world as black and white, and he is very much, like Chrissie says, good, but he does evil things to get rid of evil. but then in turn becomes evil himself.
To chip in there, sorry. I would completely agree that I think Rorschach is kind of a Batman type of character. And for the flashbacks, when he refuses to kill, and then later on, I think he becomes Batman if what he did and the years of horrors broke him, absolutely broke his mind. And
See, I think Rorschach, he's always been terrible human being, even in his previous history. I mean, as we said, he's based on a Steve Ditko character called The Question. And Steve Ditko is quite famously, he was a very reactionary guy. He was a reactionary objectivist. So Rorschach was designed to represent that. He was an ugly satire of reactionary objectivists, and he became an action hero in the film. Zack Snyder is a director who has once famously said that he wanted to adapt Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead for the big screen. He is a reactionary director. But let's take a quick trip over to Alan Moore's quote corner here, which we've done in previous episodes.
You visited this particular Alan Moore's
quote corner.
That's a thing.
It's just
Lovely.
where we keep the quotes. So
okay, cool.
Alan Moore has said, I find Ayn Rand's philosophy laughable. It was a white supremacist dream of a master race burnt into an early 20th century form. He's also said about Rorschach, I meant him to be a bad example, but I have people come to me in the street saying, I am Rorschach, that's my story. And I'll be thinking, yeah, great. Can you just keep away from me and never come near me again as long as I live? So I think the fact that Zack Snyder frames Rorschach as a sort of heroic, a cool character, he's got these slow motion fight scenes and him jumping up on balconies and stuff. It's a real egregious error of missing the point of the comic book, which is that this is a character in the comic book who spoke about a lesbian character's unsanitary lifestyle. This is a character in the comic book who is so scarred by his upbringing that he finds it disgusting to touch women's clothes when he's working at a factory. He is a character who is clearly, he hates women, he hates minorities. He subscribes to a newspaper that defends the KKK. The New Frontiersman. Yeah, is a newspaper that defends the KKK. That is who that character is meant to be, is that he is so black and white, yes. And admittedly, he is a character who is doing heroic things going out, but his worldview is absolutely backwards.
Yeah, he won't win the Nobel Peace Prize, but I reckon he believes that he's helping the world.
He absolutely believes that his worldview is right. But we, I think, as the reader, Alan Moore as the writer, understand that his mentality is abhorrent.
And I think that's a huge thing that's missing from the movie, and like you said, but completely misses the point of Rorschach, is that whole New Frontiersman is not even in the movie at all. I think his journal gets delivered there at the end, and that's about it. And what I found really interesting as well, and I think it shows how good Alan Moore is about reflecting the times and all that kind of thing. So Watchmen, the comic in the 80s, was a really good reflection of the times and of impending nuclear war, because obviously it was at the height of the Cold War and all that kind of thing. But the other thing, what I found really interesting is reading those little bits in between the issues. So there was one that was the New Frontiersman, and wow, I mean, similarities to far right news articles these days. It's quite like, wow, he's something of a prophet. I think it's mad. It just reminds me of something like Breitbart or something.
I think it was very similar, unfortunately, to newspapers of the time as well. So and they've just not changed a lot. But yeah, I agree. I think it's something that's completely absent from the film, and it almost presents that ending scene with the journal being delivered as something triumphant. It crash cuts. You have a bit of a voiceover from Rorschach, and then it crash cuts to some lively music for the credits. And it's like, in the comic book, that scene fills me with dread. I see that and I think all these characters have decided for the greater good to go along with something evil, and then, oh no, actually there's a loose end that we didn't anticipate. It might go somewhere, it might not, because it's in the crank cases, but in the film it's presented as something great. Oh look, hurrah,
Rorschach's the hero. Everyone, he saved the day. It's like, well,
no, he's just
not really. No,
now millions of people have died, and also the world's going to war again.
Well, a particular sort of quote that I picked up from him in the book is that he says, the city is dying of rabies, and the best that I can do is wipe random flecks of foam from its mouth. So I think that, to me, shows what the character is in the comics. He's a lot more in-depth, he's ruthless, compared to the, like you said, sort of hero type character he is in the film.
The weird part about the film for me is that they still have him saying morally repugnant things, but then the film presents him as a hero still, which is the weird part, is there's a dissonance between his actions and how he's presented. There's sort of these slow motion action scenes where he looks all cool and hops up on some staircases and then poses, and then he'll just say something awful about benefits or something, and it's like, hold on, what is this whiplash? And that's the difference between a script writer who has taken the original story and used that as the basis of a script, and a filmmaker who wants to present that character in a heroic light.
Yeah.
So should we talk about other characters though? So I mean, the other egregious error for me is Ozymandias, who goes from a charismatic, morally grey character who ultimately commits evil acts with the best intentions. In the film, he's very much a sneering, shifty villain looking guy right from the off.
Yeah, it's like, how in the film, how did none of you guess that he was the bad guy immediately?
Well, in the first scene, like where he's killing the comedian, I'm pretty sure you can just see him. Like, I don't know if maybe the gamma's turned up too high on my TV, but I could just see his face and was like, well, that's Ozymandias. They even give him a vaguely evil European accent from time to time. He goes from American to European.
Yes, that's to say, weirdly, I'd never noticed the accent before this watch through. And at the beginning, he definitely doesn't have the accent. But then at the end, when he goes full explaining his evil master plan, just miscellaneous European accent.
He slips into it in the middle as well. I think basically when he's in private, he speaks in that Germanish accent, that vaguely Eastern European, and then when he's in board meetings and things and when he's doing public speeches, he'll do the American hero. But the problem is, well, first of all, it's a shitty performance, absolute crap performance. You know, how you ruin a massive reveal, like in the comic, the "I did it 35 minutes ago" reveal is, it's one of the most iconic moments of comic book history. And in the comic book, it's the end of issue 11. He says the line, we cut to New York and we fade to white. It's a big reveal. In the film, it's like he sort of mumbles it and then everyone moves on with their life.
And then we do kind of also go, like, he does his mumble, but then we presumably cut back to 35 minutes ago, and then it shows the bomb exploding. I don't know, it's different. I'm sure we'll talk about that in a minute.
We will.
But it just takes the wind out of the sails of the ending, I think.
Exactly. And I think with the comic book, it's the whole issue 11. It is going back and forth between New York and between Antarctica, and you think these things are happening at the same time. And then the reveal is it happened 35 minutes ago. But in the film, we just have Antarctica. And then it goes, I did it 35 minutes ago. And then we cut back to New York 35 minutes ago. It's like,
I think it's a good example of just how using the comic book medium has not translated well at all into film.
Exactly. And worst of all for me is Ozymandias should have been Robert Redford at his peak. He should have been this sort of handsome, square-jawed American hero. He is a good character doing bad things, but Zack Snyder, even for good measure, pops a boys folder onto his desktop to imply that he's a paedophile. It's absolutely crazy.
I did not notice that.
Yeah.
That's mad.
Yeah, I saw that and I was like, why?
It's just to remove any potential further shades of grey from this character, in case there's anyone still thinking that there might be two other colours apart from black and white, as is Zack Snyder's worldview of things. It's bizarre. So those are the two worst examples for me.
No, I mean, well, you've pretty much explained him a lot more than I could, to be honest. You know, I just put I didn't like him.
That's what we got. I mean, Dr. Manhattan, I think, is fairly consistent in both.
He's fine.
He's fine, isn't he? You know, I think that's actually one of my favourite parts of the movie is when it explains how he transformed into it. And I think that works really well in the film. But I think as a character, I mean, he's fairly simple to understand, I suppose, anyway, isn't he? So it's kind of one of the few ones that's actually carried across quite well.
Yeah, obviously he's cold and calculated. But I almost feel like he's a bit more of a prick in the film than he is in the book.
How so?
We've sort of already touched on this already, but a lot of the script in the film, a lot of the dialogue is taken from the book, just not presented in a good way. So because it's in a different order and he explains things in a different way, it makes it harder to empathise with him in the film.
Yeah.
In the comic, you've got time to appreciate his backstory, you see who he is, you understand him a lot more. In the film, he's just like, I know everything.
Yeah, no, I'd actually agree with you there. I think Alan Moore's writing, he has a lot more big ideas in there, a lot of which gets cut because it's not really relevant to the plot, but it's relevant to understanding this character. And I think you lose a lot of that in the film. I actually agree with Chrissie as well, though. I think the sequence on Mars is one of the better sequences, and it's one that has been streamlined from the comic book to suit more of a film technique.
Yeah.
But yeah, the character is definitely harder to understand in the film, I would say, but he stays more or less the same if you're familiar with the character. The comedian, again, I think is a good transition, and then other characters are a little bit bland, I would say, but generally okay.
I would say even the comedian, really. I think he suffers from not a particularly good performance. I don't think the particular low light for me was when he breaks into Moloch's bedroom to like explain that. So in the comic, you know, he's super drunk and mumbling and all that kind of thing. In the movie, he kind of sits on Moloch's bed and has extremely poorly done tears going down his face. And he's just like, his saying of it's a joke, it's bad. It's so bad. That kind of ruined him for me in the movie.
Also, I think that in the comic book, there's the sequence with him and Silk Spectre too, you know, where he goes up to her after the meeting and talks to her. And in the comic book, you can interpret that in two ways. Either he's flirting or he's going, I'm seeing my daughter. In the film, that comes across very much like he's flirting.
Yeah.
The ambiguity is there in the comic book because the first time you read it, you think one thing, and the second time you think another. The problem with bringing that to the screen is that it's always going to be acted in one way.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like it did also, maybe this is coming from reading the comic book straight to watching the movie, but I think, again, it took the impact away from when it was revealed that the comedian was her father. It was like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
It was just...
Well, that's also because it was a funny Dr. Manhattan just said, I can give you my powers now, being touched her head.
Yeah, that annoyed me.
Rather than just being her remembering things, because that was too complicated.
I suppose, again, that's quite difficult to show in film, as opposed, and that's why I suppose they introduced the device of, I can zap your brain and give you memories again, although it's supposed to be her experiencing time like him, but that really, it doesn't
make any sense.
It's like, flashback, boom. No.
Yeah, I feel like in the comic, it's more of a shock, because obviously it's heavily implied it's Hooded Justice is her father, I think.
Yes.
And then you find out, oh God, it's him instead. And then the film, they don't talk about it at all. And then suddenly, oh, that guy that you hate, the guy that tried to rape your mum, yeah, that's your father. Oh, okay, cool.
That scene as well pissed me off in the film because very much the initial scene where she goes in to get changed is presented on screen like a striptease. And then it's followed up by a rape scene. It's like, oh, well, this is weird.
Yeah, it's very tonally awkward all over. Yeah, very strange.
And I suppose Nite-Owl is the only character we haven't really talked about. So, well, there's a lot of other characters, but Nite-Owl's the last main character.
Yeah.
I think he survives the transition fairly well. He's the everyman figure, so it's quite an easy transition. He's an easy character to understand in the comics as well as the film, I feel.
Yeah, I've grouped my notes really together with him and Silk Spectre.
Right.
Because I feel like they're a package, really. Yeah, I mean, he works in the film. It's fine, I guess. The one thing that I preferred in the comic than the film was that dream that he has after they try and have sex the first time and whatever.
It looks very strange in the film, doesn't it?
Really does.
It looks very strange.
In the comic, I just thought it was really unnerving. And the fact that they peel off their skin and then there's their costumes underneath and then there's an explosion, you're like, Jesus Christ, what's happening? In the film, you're like, okay, well, this is, why are they on Mars? What's going on? Oh, they've blown up. Yeah. It's a dream. Right.
It was references to a lot of things that didn't matter at that point in the film. Yeah, no, I agree with you. And the other thing I don't like about Nite-Owl's general performance in this is the changes to the ending, which we'll move on to in a minute, but the changes to ending with him witnessing Rorschach's death and falling to his knees and shouting out. Whereas in the comic, both he and Silk Spectre sort of have a quiet resignation. They take on Ozymandias. He says what he needs to say. They go, well, I suppose we better keep this secret for the best, you know, and then they go off. Whereas, you know, they have the whole scene with him beating up Ozymandias, shouting in the snow, like crying at the top of his lungs. It's like, so what is all this?
Bit out of place.
Yeah.
I think one of my favourite bits in the comics, I just need to talk about how absolutely adorable his owl winter suit is in the comics. Ruined it in the film. But man, in the comics, that is so adorable, and I want that as a onesie.
When she's going through all his suits and she finds the underwater one as well, and it's a funny little like blue outfit with a little yellow beak. It's like it's got all these different cute outfits.
Amazing. And it was not as cute in the film, which is a big shame.
I do feel that the relationships are kind of forced in the film than they are in the comic. In the comic, it seems more organic. In the film, they just sort of force upon you that she's arguing with John, and then she goes away, has one meal with whatever his name is, the actual human name. Dan, thank you.
Human name.
His
non-owl name.
Here's a non-owl name. Yeah, so they go off and have a meal, and then suddenly they're having sex almost, and then it's just like, oh, now we're a couple. And it's very forced upon you that I don't care in the film.
I think the reasoning behind it is lost a little bit. Is this idea that they are so dependent on their superhero persona that they are literally impotent without them. And that when they get back into those persona, they come alive and they can actually have sex. I think that's completely lost in the film, especially with the weird sex scene set to Hallelujah. And it says a lot about Zack Snyder, where he sets the trailer for the Justice League to the same film he sets a random sex scene to in this.
So true.
He said he chose that music and he meant it to be funny, is what he said in an interview subsequently. But that only confirms to me that Zack Snyder doesn't have a sense of humour.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so I was talking about this to Kate, actually, when we watched it last night. Well, first of all, she hates that song. Not just that version, all versions of that song, she hates it. But when Leonard Cohen created that song, he obviously had this thought about it and the way that it's not a happy song. It's a very, very sad song. And all these covers have come out that really like happy and hallelujah and yay and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
I think he said that that's not the meaning that I intended for this song, which I don't think he wanted that song to be used for a weird sex scene in a robot machine called Archie. Just before we move on, because I know that you're dying to talk about the ending or the endings, something that I did not like and did not make sense is when Silk Spectre is in Archie the first time and she's pressing all these buttons and she goes, oh, what's this? A flame? And just pushes it. And then she just sets fire to his little cave thing.
Yeah.
That makes no sense.
She seems surprised that the fire button does fire.
Yeah.
Where in the comics she's trying to light her cigarette.
Exactly.
Yeah.
She thinks it's the lighter.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Because they cut her smoking out of the film entirely. Because, again, black and white worldview, smoking bad.
That annoyed me so much in the film that I'm like, she just seems like a moron in the film. Oh, a button, a fire. Oh, there's fire.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, Dan, I didn't mean to. Moron.
Like I say, I am eager to get onto the ending. So you are in a unique position here that you saw the film before you read the comic. So your first experience with this property was with the Dr. Manhattan ending, where Dr. Manhattan destroys random places around the globe.
Yep.
And then you've read the comic book recently, and obviously there's a giant squid in it. So in your opinion, what do you make of these two different endings, and which do you prefer?
Well, when I first saw it, like you said, I just thought, wow, this is clearly the ending. He's created an explosion and he's blamed this other blue guy. Fair enough, done. When you read the comic and you realise, well, actually, he's trying to create world peace. So he's invented or created this weird octopus squid thing, and then he chucks it in the middle of New York. All hell happens and whatever. So every country around the world is on the brink of war. So when you read it, you think, okay, so he's used a threat that is neutral, so the other countries will then think, oh, well, let's all band together and blah, blah. Which, the first time that I watched the film, didn't think that much of it. I thought, fair enough. But then when you go back to it after reading the comic, you kind of think, well, that wouldn't make sense, because it's clear throughout the film that Dr. Manhattan is an American person. He's a weapon that's been created and he is from there.
Absolutely.
So
yeah.
why blame him?
Yeah.
So surely that would just cause the whole world to go, well, it's your fault. Let's raise the nuclear bombs and head towards America. And
Exactly right. Yeah. Why the hell would that unite the world? You know, they would immediately pull the trigger. They wouldn't sit around going, well, why has Dr. Manhattan done this? They would have gone, here's a known US asset that they've used in war efforts before.
Yep.
And for some reason, again, they change it from just bombing New York as well to bombing several places around the world. I don't understand that, but
yeah, so it's like,
I
I
didn't even
call it
notice
was...
that. Did that happen
Yeah,
in the
it
movie?
was-
yeah.
Oh.
they say, oh,
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
attacks going off all around the globe.
Oh. I didn't even notice
Yeah,
that.
there's little screens. So it's New York, in London, in Moscow,
Oh,
a couple of other
okay,
places.
okay.
Yeah, which
Right.
Which again,
it makes
doesn't
it
make
make
sense.
even less sense, because if it was
Yeah.
just Dr. Manhattan nuking New York, you would think, oh, the rest of the world will unite around that and help him. But the fact that they then made it Moscow and all the other places, you would think that they would go, yeah, America's attacking us, stop it. Think of it this way, if American nuclear weapons accidentally started going off all around the world, and then one of them happened to go off in New York, that wouldn't unite the world, would it? You know, no one would go, well, poor America, they've also in trouble. Yeah.
No.
Whereas a completely interdimensional alien species, a threat that is completely external, is what was needed to unite the world, which Dr. Manhattan isn't. He is a known US asset. So it pisses me off more than anything, this ending, because it doesn't make any sense.
So I've got a fairly unique view on this one. So before I reread and rewatched the movie yesterday, I was of the view that I thought that the ending of the film made more sense.
Right.
So, but let me explain myself here. So
Get out.
The reason
Leave.
The reason I thought that is because I guess similar to what you said, Ian, is that, oh, he's attacked the world, great, he's going to unite, brilliant. And then I thought that the comic book ending was a squid appears. I thought it was a bit random, but then I think this is where the comic definitely benefits from a second reading, is that it is building massively towards that, like the disappearance of the writer, the comedian seeing them all on the island, and that's why he knows about the thing, which, thinking about it, it's pretty much not explained in the movie why the comedian knows anything about Ozymandias' plan at all. But that aside, on second viewing, it makes much more sense, the comic. And I think one throwaway, not throwaway line, but one line that I missed in the comic the first time round was that it's not just a giant squid appearing, it sends out a giant psychic blast that also convinces everyone that aliens exist. And I'm like, right, that suddenly makes a million times more sense. Yeah. And then watching the movie again immediately after reading the comic, it's like the plausibility of why would Dr. Manhattan, he goes to do a TV interview and then he gets sad because he thinks he's caused cancer on like 4 or 5 people, so he disappears to Mars and then kills 15 million people. It's like that. Just no.
The news starts reporting on it straight away. It's like, well, Dr. Manhattan's angry at us because we're on the brink of nuclear war. It's like, so how have you got that information? Where did you get that information from?
Have you got an interview with Dr. Manhattan? No, because he's on Mars. No, yeah, so like literally completely reversed, having watched it all through a second time.
Oh, the comic massively rewards rereading, I find. I know this is something that Ian can probably look forward to, I suppose, if we'll discuss at the end whether he enjoyed it and whether he'll be rereading it or recommending it. But in issue 5, for instance, the panels are laid out so that the pacing going forward is the same as the pacing going backwards, with a climactic action scene coming exactly at the halfway mark. And this is about Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons using every trick of comic books that they can to tell their story. Despite the name of the issue being Fearful Symmetry, you might not even recognise that on the first read through, the second read through, you might not notice it at all, but it's there. And I think this is what Alan Moore does really well, especially it's what sets him apart from other writers at the time. It's a level of thought that goes into each and every panel, and it's given as much care and attention as every single page, as every single issue, as the whole series as a whole. Yeah, I've said on this podcast before about the scripts which are in the back of the Absolute edition. The original scripts for the comic book have got, for each panel, a page of description. A written page of, this is what it is, this is what it means, this is why we are seeing the first panel of the first issue is a gutter and a pavement, and then slowly over the panels the blood rushes into it and a badge runs into it. And there is a reason for that. There's a description of the sweet wrapper that's going to get washed into the thing. All of it has a reason. And this is what Alan Moore does better than anyone else, is world building through what you're seeing. And that is where comic books differentiate from prose. Obviously, prose have to describe all these things. Alan Moore describes it and then leaves it to an artist to say, I'm putting all of this in there. There is a reason for it, and it will reward people who pay attention.
Yeah, well, actually, a note that I did make that I actually forgot to type up, but there is a panel on both page 53 and 127. You see different portrayals or different perspectives of the same conversation. That's quite handy that if you flick between 53 and 127, that panel is in the exact same place. I like the attention that he's put in there, the fact that I've picked up on these things on my first read. Imagine if I read it 2 or 3 more times.
Yeah, absolutely. There's loads to pick up on. And speaking of picking up on things, I think it's about time that we get on to, and this may be a difficult one this week, Iain's Egg Hunt. Iain's Egg Hunt. Iain's Egg Hunt. Iain's Egg Hunt.
I'm not yoking you. So, we've obviously blended together the film and the comic. There's a lot to take apart here, really. I call them eggs. You might say it's things that I've seen.
Is this just you preparing us to say that you haven't got any Easter eggs and you're just going to point out several things now?
That you've seen?
No, I think some of these are Easter eggs.
Okay, cool.
Okay, interesting.
So, in the opening montage, as we've said, you see all these dim characters. The original Owl Man, or Nite-Owl, as he should be called, he can be seen punching a guy outside the opera house, and it's the Gotham Opera House. And there's a couple coming out, so clearly he's saved them from being mugged. So it's meant to imply that that's Bruce Wayne's parents.
Amazing.
But what I don't get is that in the background on the wall on the far right, there's a poster for Batman and Robin. So I don't get that his parents were saved for being killed, but still there's a poster for Batman in the background.
Is this your first example of one Easter egg counteracting another Easter egg?
Doesn't make sense, does it?
I mean, it's an Easter egg, though. It's not exactly central to the plot.
Well, yeah.
But I think it's kind of implied that something that I noted down is that they mentioned Superman in it as well. And by the sounds of it, early on in like the 30s or whatever, superheroes were a big comic thing. But then when superheroes became a real life, that kind of died out because nobody was interested in that. And so would you not think that maybe the Batman and Robin poster on there is like, cool, that's the world, and then the bit where is it Nite-Owl that you said saves, so the
original
that bit's the Easter egg, that's the nod to it, and the poster is like that they were real comic book characters in this world.
Yeah, I mean, I can't explain it.
There's a real Nite-Owl has saved a real Bruce Wayne.
But is it the real Bruce? It gets very meta. I
feel like they should have included one or the other of those references.
Yeah, you're probably right. Otherwise,
that's what I don't get.
We get confused.
But yeah, I mean,
if only you could have considered the Easter egg segments on the podcast of the future, Alan Moore.
God,
let's not blame Alan Moore for this.
No, that's fair.
But yeah, I mean, speaking of comic book sort of references, the Gunga Diner appears in both the film and the comic, which I quite like that they included that.
Mm-hmm. There's lots of stuff that appears in the film.
Rorschach's in both of them as well.
Yeah, I know.
Archie, that was there. There's a big blue guy. You may have missed him.
Wait, the
it's pretty
film
subtle.
and the comic are both called Watchmen. Sorry.
Well, no. Speaking of Watchmen, I'm
Yes,
not sure if Chrissie picked up on this, but in the director's cut of the film, in the scene where Hollis gets attacked and killed, as he falls to the ground, you actually see that he owns a copy of the book Watchmen.
Interesting.
Well, that makes no fucking sense.
That does make no sense. And I'll tell you why I didn't pick up on that. It's because I was very bored and I went to make myself a cup of tea during that fight scene.
Okay, well, you mentioned earlier on about the use of music, and we've laughed at Hallelujah, but I think that music plays a large role in both the film and the comic. Obviously, you said that there's Bob Dylan's The Times They Are A-Changing in the opening scene, and also covers of Desolation Row, also along the Watchtower. The latter of that is the closing quote from chapter 10. It says, "Outside in the cold distance, a wild cat did growl. 2 riders were approaching. The wind began to howl." So I quite like that they've obviously adapted that sort of quote and used the song in the film.
I'm pretty sure there's a chapter or a segment that's called The Times They Are A-Changing as well.
Speaking of music, not really an Easter egg, something that I saw in the opening montage. You can see the Village People, David Bowie and Mick Jagger.
Yes.
Well, not them, but, people portraying them.
Was it not the real ones?
No, it wasn't, sadly.
They didn't get those.
No.
They didn't get them. No, that's a shame.
I think I can imagine they could have got the Village People if they need to. They're not up to much.
Yeah, I can't imagine that. If you've got to spare, £100, you can probably get them to come to your birthday party.
But yeah, there's a lot more in there, including when, what's Adrian's name again?
Ozymandias.
Ozymandias, yep. So when he's watching all those screens, you see a lot of things from the 80s, obviously that's when it's sort of set. But I will end this segment with a callback to a previous Easter egg that I had on our last episode with a guest on.
Okay.
So when we had on Josh, I mentioned an Easter egg about the keypad, and if you
one Stan,
and it spells out Stan.
Yeah. See, I do listen to you.
And Josh jokingly said, "Is that an Easter egg to Stanley Kubrick?" Which, haha, Josh, if you're listening, that was hilarious. But in the film, towards the start, when they get that picture taken of the original crew, the Minutemen, the original
Crime Busters,
yes.
The original Nite-Owl says, "Thank you, Ouija," to the cameraman. And this is a nod to the famous photographer Arthur Fleck, probably said his last name wrong, who famously collaborated with Stanley Kubrick.
Wow, that's almost like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon separation there, but still not bad.
Okay. Well, no, there were some complex eggs, but very nice. Thank you very much for those. Shall we move on to the conclusion and just wrap things up for now?
Yeah, let's go for it.
In that case, we haven't really asked you, I've realised. You were reading this for the first time and you were obviously watching this again. So what are your opinions on the film and the comic book?
Well, I want to start off by saying something that you guys said at the start, which I actually don't agree with. I appreciated and enjoyed the film a lot more after I read the comic.
Right.
Because like you said, I filled in some parts of it, not all of it. But the comic book on its own, I think it's fantastic. You know, it's intriguing, it's well written, it does grab your attention, even though it's a lot to digest. It's very heavy, it's a long old book. But yeah, I didn't bounce off this like I have done with Moore's previous works that we've read.
Yeah, I was going to say, because I think with exception of The Killing Joke, you've always been a bit iffy about Alan Moore's writing so far, but you enjoyed this one.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably say, in the order of what we've read with Moore, I'd probably put Watchmen at the top, then The Killing Joke, then The League, and then V.
Fair enough. Yeah, pretty sound order. But the film you enjoyed more this time around, having read the comic.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I appreciated it a lot more. There are large chunks that is taken out. I didn't find out about the other cuts of the film until I'd seen it. So I'm intrigued to go and watch those. Not right now, because I think I've had a lot of exposure to Watchmen over the last week. So I'll probably wait for a bit and then go back and watch the extended cuts. Because there are bits in it where they go into other characters' backstories that I think I'd hope I enjoy.
Yeah. You could go and watch the HBO Watchmen series.
Fantastic.
Wow.
Very good.
Absolutely amazing.
Funny you say that, because I watched the first 2-3 episodes of that and then phased off of it.
Oh man, I don't know how you could have done that. I think where the original Watchmen is an incredible reflection of like the mid-80s and the height of the Cold War, the TV show is an incredible reflection of, you know, issues around race in modern society. It's just, absolutely outstanding.
I think that's what does that really good thing, which is what I said earlier about adapting a source material to suit its medium that it's in this case the television medium, and also to adapt it to a modern setting. You know, you take the themes of the comic book and use those. It's more important than just taking the storyline or the aesthetics.
Yeah, I feel like we missed a trick by one, I suppose, originally not being around in the 80s when the original thing was released. It probably would have had a bit of a different context with which to experience the comic book. And again, that's probably something that the film just, because it was released in, 2009? It just didn't work.
But what about you, Chrissie? What were your opinions of the film and the comic book in general?
So I think the comic book, having reread it, it's up there for me of one of my favourite ones of all time. You know, Alan Moore, I think, is one of the best comic book writers, and I think Watchmen is his best work. I think it's just so interesting. There's so many layers to it. You can read it again and again and always find something new. And a lot of the themes, while it was very present to the time of the 80s, a lot of the themes are relevant today. So yeah, I think it's up there with one of my favourite ones. The film, you know, Zack Snyder's gonna Zack Snyder, isn't he? You know, there's not really much you can do about that. It's fine. I think 2.5 stars, I think was the thing you get it. I'd agree with that.
Out of 10 or out of 5?
Out of 5.
Okay.
Maybe 2 stars. Yeah, I think that in every sense, Zack Snyder was the wrong person to do that movie. And I think everything he got wrong in that movie, they got right with the TV show. I would encourage you to watch that, you know, to finish it, because it is just incredible if you enjoyed the comic.
Yeah. I think I will go back to it.
Yeah, and I'm even more annoyed at Zack Snyder than I already have been for most of the things he's ever done. The fact that now I've come to kind of absolutely love the comic, that he just did, he did it dirty, basically. Yeah. Why did they let him keep making things? Is my question that I'm taking away from this.
So, Iain, you've asked us our opinions. What was yours?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, Zack Snyder has never been a director with an overabundance of subtlety. It makes him exactly the wrong person to direct this film. Whilst he's shown that he can replicate comics on an aesthetic level, he either can't convey or doesn't understand the themes of the source material. The whole film lacks depth and nuance, and it's all instead been substituted by a sleek coolness and slow motion that is completely antithetical to the comic book. Like Chrissie says, it's not terrible, but it's not good. And it just feels like a missed opportunity because, you know, the comic book, I agree, is one of my absolute favourites. I first read the comic when we were all in school. And even though I don't think I probably fully understood it at the time, I absolutely loved it. I've read it a few times since, and I'm pleased to say that for me, it holds up 100% every time I read it. It's a truly substantial, multi-layered piece of storytelling. It's Alan Moore and perhaps even Dave Gibbons at their peak, and every time I reread it, I discover more to like. I think it's an amazing feat that they've crafted such an immersive world, characters and a story that still resonate as well today as they did when they were written over 30 years ago?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this already. I would say the film's all right, and the comic is the true story here. It's a better format to show this kind of story. But what do you both prefer?
The comic book.
Yeah, the comic book.
Yeah.
And in terms of what you would recommend, I would recommend the comic book. I would not recommend the film.
Never.
I'm a bit iffy on this one because I would recommend both, but I'd recommend you read it first.
Right.
Because if you're like me, you fill in a little bit of the gaps.
I just think there's far better ways to spend 2.5 hours.
The director's cut was 3 hours. The ultimate cut is 3.5 hours. Do not waste your time with that.
Yeah, you could watch the whole of Justice League Zack Snyder cut in that
Almost one whole time.
But I am in the view that the comic is the better way to portray this tale. And the way that they show Dr. Manhattan in the comics, it's easier to understand. He's someone that sees past, present, and future at the same time. So in the comic, it portrays it through a few panels that you can see these periods. If the film was to try to copy that and do flash forwards and flashbacks every other scene, it wouldn't work.
Yeah.
So the comic is the easier way to read
The
it.
annoying thing is what you can do with film is you can put all three of those things up on screen at the same time, play them as though they're showing them at the same time, and you can experience them simultaneously. These are filmic techniques that you can employ to do the same thing, but they haven't done that. They've tried to replicate the comic.
Three things on screen at once at the same time, that's far too complicated for Mr. Snyder, I think.
But one more opinion we can get, an opinion from someone who hasn't read the comic at all. So what is Kate's opinion?
So she said it's a less exciting Sin City with a lot more superheroes, and it does not have to be 2.5 hours long.
Fair enough.
I think that's fair criticism of any of Zack Snyder's films. It does not need to be that long.
All of Zack Snyder's films are less exciting Sin Cities.
Maybe not that bit, but although, Sin City's a good film.
It's not wrong.
No.
All right, I think that's good for now. So let's wrap it up there. Thank you, Chrissie, for coming on the show.
It's been my pleasure.
And thank you all for listening. That's all for this episode. If you enjoyed Watchmen, then why not check out our other episodes on Alan Moore's other works, V for Vendetta, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and Batman, The Killing Joke. We'll also be covering some of Zack Snyder's other comic book adaptations in the near future, so whatever you're listening on, make sure to subscribe to Become the Teapot so you don't miss out. As always, you can get in touch with us by emailing us at becometheteapot@hotmail.com or tweet us at becometheteapod. We're also on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Next episode, we move from who watches the Watchmen to who guards the old guard. Whatever that question means, the answer is apparently not me, because for the first time in this show's history, I've neither seen the film nor read the comic that we'll be covering.
But I have.
So join us next time as we watch and read The Old Guard.
Is The Old Guard the one with...
Charlize Theron.
Yeah, that's a shit film.
I think there is a lot of Easter eggs in this, but I didn't go through all of them because A, it's a 2.5 long film, and 3, it...
A and 3.
2.5 hours as well, you probably meant to say.
It's 2.5 long
Yeah, so...
film. It's a 2.5 star
films
film,
long.
I'll tell you that.
So it's a 2.5 long hour. What? I'll start again, mate. I'm going to start again.
I'll use this bit for the after credits.